everyone. How are you guys? Good evening, everyone. How are you guys? Welcome to the Stockton area Atheists and Freethinkers colloquium in partnership with the Stanislaus Skeptics. I want to thank you guys all for being here today and taking time out of your life to learn about other stuff. I think that's really cool. That's why we do all kinds of awesome things in this group. How many people are actually like regular members of either the Stockton area Atheists and Freethinkers or the Stanislaus Skeptics? Raise your hands. Way cool. And everybody else, welcome. If this is your first time, especially welcome, and thank you for taking the time to come out here. I want to say thank you to a lot of people, especially CSU Stanislaus for letting us use the facility tonight. I want to thank Freedom and Nathan and Terry for planning everything and setting this all up. I also want to thank, of course, Dr. Noelle for coming all the way up here from Merced. Thank you. And to all the other people who make our events happen, like Charlie and Lisa. I don't see you here, but who else? Freedom, of course, and... oh, you are there. That's right. You did walk in. And Vince and everyone else in the Stockton group as well. It's you guys who really make this happen, and I want to thank you in front of everyone because you don't always get a chance to do that. For those of you who are not really familiar with our group, the Stockton area Atheists and Freethinkers, we are a bit of a mix of social stuff and political activism stuff. We're education stuff. Hopefully people join our group because they're trying to find others who share the same values, who have the same worldview to life, and they want to be social and make those connections happen. And so that's really what we do. We also do a little bit of volunteer work, and I encourage you guys to come out and help us with that whenever we have one of these things going on. And I'll tell you about one in just a little bit. We do have some really cool events coming up here, and this is just a small sample of what we have. I encourage you guys to go to our website and take a look and see all the things that we're doing. For example, up here on the 18th, we have our Brunch and Atheism event at Panera Bread. We just hang out, we eat, we talk, we have a good time because, well, we're not going to church on Sunday, so we have to do something, right? If you have families, or if you act like a kid, hang out with us on our secular family days that Freedom organizes. The next one is the September 1st. It's going to be in Stockton at Pixie Woods. It should be a lot of fun because immediately after that event, on that same day, we're going to have a giant barbecue and potluck at Colleen's home, also in Stockton. She lives right next to the Hagen Museum. And so it's sort of a 2-for-1 event. Go to one, go to both if you'd like to. And then on September 14th, if you don't mind a drive to San Francisco. It's the 4th annual Atheist Film Festival. And they just yesterday released a whole list of all the films, the documentaries, the shorts, and the animation and stuff that they're going to put together. There's a really cool documentary about one of those investigative journalism pieces on schools and religion going into schools, about the Good News Club. There's all kinds of really great pieces, including the first ever showing of the film Hug an Atheist, which is really cool. So I encourage you to spend the day in San Francisco with everyone else at the Roxy. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then up in Lodi on October 6th, we have one of our community outreach events where we have a table or a tent at the Lodi Street Fair. That is always a lot of fun. We get a lot of people come up and ask us questions. Sometimes they're not happy to see us there, but most of the time they really are, and they love hearing about our group. Sometimes they're just curious about what we do and what we believe or don't believe, and they ask questions, and that's a lot of fun too. And so we're looking for people to just come hang out with us for a couple hours and fill up our booth and be available to answer questions for folks. And then on October 12th is probably the largest event that you're ever going to see in Northern California, maybe even all of California, in terms of a free event that is outside and a lot of fun for Free Thought. It's Sacramento's 12th annual Free Thought Day. And this is an all-day, outdoor, family-friendly, with live entertainment. We've got Shelley Siegel from Australia coming out with her guitar. It is going to be really cool. We've got some awesome speakers, including Edwina Rogers, who's the president of the Secular Coalition of America. Greta Christina, the famous blogger from San Francisco, is going to be there. We have the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, Annie Laurie Gaylor, will be there. And a whole lot of other folks, including a number of authors who've brought their books to talk to you about their stuff and get you to sign their books and all that kind of thing. They sign your books, you know what I mean. Anyway, and then talking about giving back, really special to a lot of us is the Light the Night Walk. This is an event that's put on by the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society up in Sacramento, and the entire region, Sacramento, Stockton, Modesto, Turtle Rock, of course, the Bay Area, we're all getting together to support the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society as the coalition of reason. Every single atheist, free-thinking, skeptic, secular, whatever group. Last year, we raised nearly $5,000. We were the third largest group in Sacramento's chapter, which is really awesome for us. And not only that, but that was matched by the national organization, the Foundation Beyond Belief. And I think this year we can do even better. And so I encourage everybody to check out our website, learn about the Night of the Night event, because you can either donate now, you can get friends to donate for you, and when you go out there, we're going to really show our support for the folks who are survivors of leukemia and lymphoma, and folks who need help. And if you want to talk more with me about that, just ask me anything you want. It's a really cool event, and even if you can't make it on October 26th, please consider a donation. The link is up on our website, and I can help you find that if you need to. So, speaking of our website, StocktonAAF.org. That's our meetup page where we have all of our official events. You can sign up there if you haven't done so already. It's completely anonymous. If you want it to be, just give them a fake name. It's okay. And if you're also on Facebook, you can find us. Just search for Stockton Area Atheist Freethinkers on Facebook, or the Stanislaus Skeptics. There's also the Modesto Humanists, and all kinds of stuff going on right here in Central Valley. Finally, after we're done here tonight, after our Q&A, we are going to hang out, sort of an after party at Pizza Factory. It is just down the street, right around the corner here. And so I hope everybody can join us for a little bit of pizza, some drinking, whatever they have there going on. If you can't, okay, but can I just get a quick show of hands, just so I kind of know how many we want? How many people think they're probably going to go to that? If you can just raise your hand real quick.
What time will that be about?
No.
I haven't been, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. It depends on how long we keep them here with our questions, really. All right, so it looks like about 12 to 24 people, somewhere in that vicinity. Excellent. Well, like I said, I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight, although I may say that we may learn tonight that you didn't have a choice to come here at all. And so if that's the case, well, you're here anyway. And so I'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. David Noelle here. David comes from UC Merced. And is there any other UC Merceds? Excellent. Thank you for making the trek up here as well. Do they get like extra credit for that, or? Oh. All right. Well, Dr. Noelle is an associate professor of cognitive and information sciences at UC Merced. He's got a Ph.D. in cognitive science and computer science from UCSD. That's awesome. He's got his postdoctoral training at the Center for Neural Basis of Cognition at Carnegie Mellon, if I said that right. And his research involves a lot of stuff that I don't even know what it is. The fabrication, analysis, and testing of computational models of brain function with a focus on the prefrontal cortex, I've heard of that, and its role in learning, memory, and control of behavior. And of course, something close to my heart is he's also the faculty advisor for the Secular Student Alliance chapter, the Society of Freethinkers at UC Merced. Without further ado, let's plug in your laptop and get you rolling. Dr. David Noelle.
Give me a second to make a switch here. Okay, well, thanks very much for coming out on a Thursday night. This is a good-sized crowd. This is the first time I've given this talk, so you get to be guinea pigs, get to be subjects here. I'll appreciate your constructive criticism at the end. I have a little bit less than an hour of material here. I'll try to race it if you guys start looking bored. And hopefully there will be time to Q&A afterwards. The title of this talk is The Matter of Choice. And it starts with an introduction. Introduction that probably isn't quite as nice as the next one that David gave me. Thank you. The introduction is to a gentleman named Charles Whitman. Charles Whitman was 25 years old in 1966. He was an Eagle Scout. He was an ex-US Marine. He was tested using the Stanford Binet IQ test at one point. He scored over 130 in the top 99th percentile for that IQ test at the time. On August 1st, 1966, he decided to make a choice. He killed his mother and his wife, packed up a bag of rifles and a sawed-off shotgun, and climbed this tower at the University of Texas, where he was a student of architectural engineering. Meeting the receptionist in the tower, he beat her to death with the butt of his rifle. And several tourist families ascended the tower. He shot them at point-blank range. Went onto the observation deck of the tower and proceeded to open fire on people in the street. His first target was a pregnant woman. When her boyfriend came to her aid, he shot him. Other pedestrians, an ambulance arrived. The ambulance driver was shot. In all, he killed at least 13 people. Some people died from complications years later. Several dozen were wounded. He made this choice to do this, despite being a very intelligent man, a man that was a contributor to his society. Something clearly was going on, something was wrong, and interestingly, he knew it. He kept a journal. He wrote a rather elaborate suicide note. He said things like, "I don't really understand myself these days. I'm supposed to be an average, reasonable, and intelligent young man. However, lately, I can't recall when it started, I've been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts." He even sought help. He said, "I talked with a doctor for about 2 hours and tried to convey to him my fears that I felt overcome by overwhelming violent impulses. After one session, however, I never saw the doctor again, and since then I've been fighting my mental turmoil alone and seemingly to no avail." He seemed to clearly understand that something wrong was going on, but it didn't stop him from making plans and executing them. He wrote in his letter, "It was after much thought that I decided to kill my wife, Kathy, tonight. I love her dearly, and she's been as fine a wife to me as any man could hope to have. I cannot rationally pinpoint any specific reason for doing this." Why am I introducing you to Charles Whitman? I'm introducing him to you to make a very poignant example of what you probably already know. And that is, people's choices, what they decide to do, have something to do with what's going on in their brains. And the reason that we know that that was the case in Charles Whitman is he had an autopsy after his death. He actually asked to have an autopsy done in his suicide letter. And inside his brain, this isn't his brain on the left, this is just a picture of one hemisphere of the brain. They found a nickel-sized tumor, along with some vascular problems, right near the hypothalamus, impinging on a part of the brain called the amygdala. Just pointed out here on the left. You can see that's a little red dot here in this computer-generated image. It's deep inside your brain. It comes from a Greek word for almond. It's a little almond-shaped growth at the tip of the hippocampus. There's two of them, one on the left, one on the right, two hemispheres to your brain. And this tumor there is right impinging on the hypothalamus, a place where basic drives, need for food, need for water, and the amygdala, a place associated with fear and aggression and other emotional responses, right in there. It was waiting to be discovered. Panel looked at the vasculature, the problems around the tumor, and conjectured that perhaps there were congenital problems in this part of the brain and how it grew that made it easier for the tumor to form. But it seems really clear, or at least very likely, that it was this growth that transformed our Eagle Scout U.S. Marine into someone who seemed to have no problems with killing his loving wife and a whole bunch of strangers. Our brain has something to do with the choices that we make. And not just life or death choices. Every choice that we make, whether we're deciding what beverage to have with dinner, how we're going to spend our money, what car we're going to buy, whether we're going to get married or not, career decisions. We're faced with these choices every day. And what modern neuroscience and psychology with the cognitive sciences has found is that there's increasing evidence that when we're faced with these choices, it's properties of the structure and function of the brain that seem to be driving these choices. Now that's interesting. It's interesting because we feel as if the choices are ours, that we made those choices, and yet we did not choose the structure and function of our brain. Instead, things like our genetic heritage, what we inherited from mom and dad, have an effect in the structure of our brain and how it developed over time, as well as developmental experiences, experiences that we had as a young child, experiences that we've even had as adults. Our brain is particularly plastic. That means it changes with experience. When something happens to us, when we're rewarded for doing a deed, when we're punished for another, there's a change in the wiring of the brain. The physical structure changes as a result of that. But for the most part, we don't choose those experiences that we have. So we're faced with an interesting problem. Our choices are emerging from an organ in our skull, from our brains, and it's emerging from the structure and function of that organ, but we did not choose that structure and function. That was chosen for us, in large part, by our DNA and by our experiences and interactions between those things. This problem has a name. Some philosophers refer to it as the problem of free will. And concisely, the problem goes like this. If our choices arise from deterministic causal processes, the physical laws of nature, in what sense can these choices be seen as freely made by an individual, as freely made by me? How can it be that I can be said to be making this choice, to choosing to do this deed, if indeed that choice is arising from the physical laws that govern the biology of my brain and its history? Or to put it another way, if our choices are determined by factors outside of our control, our genes and our developmental history, how can we be held responsible, receiving either praise or blame for the choices that we make? Now, to kind of highlight this problem, the first thing that we need to clarify is what I meant when I said that the world here is seen as being a world of deterministic causal processes. This is pretty much the perspective that any scientist brings to the world. We're trying to find the regularities in the world that cause the past states of the world to give rise to the future and determine the evolution, if you will, of events in time. This notion of determinism is a hypothesis. We don't know for 100% certainty that it's true of the world. But again, most scientists come to the world with this perspective that future states of the world are a strict function of past states, shaped by these causal natural laws. Now, there's a lot of misunderstanding about determinism, about this perspective towards reality. In particular, some people think, well, there's some things that aren't strictly causal, that aren't like one billiard ball hitting another, that there's some craziness in the world, there's some randomness. And indeed, some of them, the more educated ones, will turn to quantum physics and say, look, quantum physicists, at least popular interpretations of quantum physics, Copenhagen interpretation, say that at the fundamental level, the universe contains truly random events. This really doesn't violate the notion of determinism in the sense that we can, with slight modification, see a version of determinism that speaks not to future events being strictly caused by the past, but the probability distribution, the range of possible things that could happen, or likely things that can happen, are determined by past events. There's a little bit of randomness there. But still, the range of possibilities and their likelihood is strictly determined by the past, and everything else is just randomness. There's no magic here. So determinism is consistent with the idea that in the world there might be some random processes. The other misconception that people often have is they say, well, I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The weatherman can't get it right. I can't get it right. This lack of predictability must mean that there's more randomness or something that isn't very deterministic. There aren't these regularities that scientists are looking for. And that shows a misconception. Determinism doesn't mean that the world is predictable, even if you had a lot of knowledge. There's a field of mathematics called chaos theory or complexity theory that shows that unless we had infinitely perfect knowledge about the past state of the world is complex enough that we won't be able to predict the future, even if the processes that give rise to the future are perfectly deterministic, follow very natural regularities. It's just, things are too complex to make them predictable. A philosopher named Daniel Dennett, philosopher and cognitive scientist Daniel Dennett, has written extensively about this point, trying to explain that when you get to the level of complexity of the real world, there are plenty of times where the world could be deterministic, but you still couldn't predict what's going to happen. Perhaps most importantly, though, there's often a confusion between determinism and what's been called fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that my future, the outcome, whether I'm going to become a big rock star or not, is kind of set in the cards. It's fixed. No matter what I do, I could lie in bed and I'm still going to become a big rock star. That's not what determinism says. Determinism says that the future depends on the current and past state of the world, and that includes the current and past state of me and what I'm going to do and what I'm motivated to do. My actions count in determinism, whereas they don't count in fatalism. So as we move forward, we talk about this perspective of the world being determined by physical law. Keep in mind that I'm not saying that you can just go home and have a beer and the same thing will happen if you went to your job. That's not the case. You are part of the world, according to the deterministic perspective, and therefore you play a part in what happens in the future. Now, given this view, this very scientific view, we're finding the causal laws of the world, this deterministic view, some people have thought that doesn't leave a lot of room for me being the source of my choices. And in particular, they hold a particular view of what it means to be the source of a choice, what it means to have free will. And that particular view is called contra-causal free will. And it can be briefly summarized in this first bullet. A truly free choice cannot be caused by anything outside of the self, outside of the will. If it's caused by anything else, then it really isn't free. It's caused by those other forces. So truly free choice, according to the person that advocates for contra-causal free will, cannot be caused by anything else in the world. So they say, if determinism is true, then all choices are caused by past states of the world, including states that predate my very existence. There was a world before me, and that world gave rise to how it was a little later, and eventually gave rise to me, and gave rise to the state of my brain, and gave rise to this choice. So, the advocates of contra-causal free will say, determinism and free will therefore are incompatible. Determinism says that my choices must have been caused by this past, and free will, they say, can't involve a choice that's caused by anything outside of me. The position supporting contra-causal free will, in general, is called libertarianism. It's not related to the political position. It's just the name that philosophers use. And it's the name that I'll be using here. And it introduces kind of a breakdown of different positions about this issue of choice. One possibility. Now, if I was a philosopher, I could break this down into 9 or 16 different categories. I hope if there are philosophers in the room, they'll forgive me. I'm going to try to keep this simple here. One possibility is determinism is false. That is to say, there are things in the world other than causal forces and maybe some randomness. This is the position of the libertarian. Free will, then, which is claimed to exist, contra-causal free will is claimed to exist, this free will is grounded in some other thing, some non-causal process that's fundamentally different than all of the causes and randomness that we currently understand in physical and biological processes. That's one position. The alternative is to say, no, the world really is deterministic. There really are these natural laws that determine how things unfold, including us. But this can be broken down into two sub-positions. One, I'm calling illusionism, though I'm the only person in the world that probably calls it this. If you look in the philosophical literature, this is often called incompatibilism in comparison to the last one. Illusionism is a position that's held by a number of people, a lot of people these days, and it essentially claims that free will is an illusion. It does not exist, and to the degree that we feel that it exists, we're deceiving ourselves. In comparison, there are folks that claim that no, actually there is room for a notion of free will that is compatible with determinism. Now, it's not contra-causal free will. It's not what the libertarians believe. So while contra-causal free will doesn't exist, compatible to say there are other notions of free will that are useful to us that are compatible with determinism. Now, we're going to look at each of these. And we'll start with libertarianism very briefly because there were very prominent libertarians in the past, including René Descartes. René Descartes, who made these drawings, had a very mechanistic view of the world. He saw reflexes and what was going on in our bodies, and even in a lot of our minds being driven by little machines. He'd talk about pulleys and ropes and things and various mechanisms that would control how we pull our hand back from the fire. But when it came time to make a free choice, he said, that doesn't hold. He said there's got to be something other than causal forces that drive our choices, because our choices are free. We don't see those kinds of things in the world, so they must not exist in the world. They exist in another world. They exist in the world of the mind, the world of the soul. This is a position that's called substance dualism. To me, there's two parts, dual parts, the body and this spirit or soul, and they communicate somehow, which he wasn't really clear on, except that he thought it was through the pineal gland, this little part of the brain in the front. So taken with the notion of free will was Descartes that he said there needs to be something new in reality, something other than causation and randomness in reality in order to account for free will. Modern libertarians don't necessarily depend on substance dualism, the idea that there's a soul to make these choices. They claim that maybe there's something else in the world that's not causal-like, and they'll look at the nuances of quantum mechanics, saying maybe there's something really weird down at the subatomic level that can account for how it really isn't cause, but it's still a choice. So they look for other sorts of explanations. They haven't really found a coherent story yet, though. But none of this might matter, because back when this nation was just starting to form, philosophers said, actually, the kind of free will that these libertarians are talking about actually doesn't make a lot of sense. And a big proponent of this was a philosopher named David Hume. David Hume said, look, if my choices are not caused by the past, are not caused by the experiences I've had in the past, the knowledge I acquired in the past, if they're not caused by that, then what's driving them? Are they just arbitrary? What kind of choice is that? To just do something without cause, without any reason. That's not really the kind of choice we want. That's not a reasonable, moral, free will. That's just being crazy. That's just doing stuff. And in his words, actions are, by their very nature, temporary and perishing, and where they proceed not from some cause in the character or disposition, the state of the person who performed them, they can either redound to his honor, if good, or infamy of evil. They seem silly. They're arbitrary. They're not the kinds of things that we would value as a choice. So whether even if libertarians are right, and there is some mechanism there, Hume would say that mechanism can't explain what we want from a free will. It's not a free will worth having. This has been illustrated by a contemporary philosopher, a guy named Richard Carrier, who's in San Francisco. Some of you may have met him. He likes attending free thought events and the like. He has this kind of time machine thought experiment. And he said, okay, imagine that you're interacting with your kid, and your kid really makes you angry. And for a moment you think, I'm going to take this kid and bash his head in, but no. You step back, and you take a deep breath, and think of a nice grassy field, and you don't make that choice. You choose not to harm your child. Dr. Carrier asked, okay, what if we could kind of set the clock back and set it back to that instant just before you made that choice, where everything in the past was exactly the same, all the possible causal forces were exactly the same. Determinism would say that your choice is determined by that past, so you would make the same choice. You would step back and take a breath. Libertarianism says, however, that you can do anything. Maybe one time you bash his brains in, one time you don't, one time you sing him a song. Any choice would be possible. And Carrier says, is that really a reasonable notion of free will? Do you want to have a kind of free will where you could just do anything regardless of your character or your past or the circumstances? And again, like Hume, he's arguing that it's not. That even if libertarians could find some magical mechanism that transcends causes, it wouldn't be the kind of free will worth having. So for most of the rest of this talk, we'll come back to it at the very end, I'm going to set libertarianism aside. Most philosophers in this domain, most scientists in this domain say, okay, we don't see any real evidence for there being some sort of mechanism like this, or even if there was one, it's not what we really mean by free will. So I want to focus on these last two options. The options in which determinism is true. And we'll start with illusionism. And this is really where I enter the story. As I said, I'm not trained as a philosopher. I'm a philosopher on my thesis committee, but still, I'm not really trained as a philosopher. I'm trained as a neuroscientist. I make computational models of the frontal lobes. And recently, there have been a number of both philosophers and scientists that have looked at neuroscientific data, studies of the brain, and said, hey, there's real evidence here for the idea that free will is a complete illusion. It does not exist, and we're deceiving ourselves if we claim that it exists. People like Wagner here, who wrote a book called The Illusion of Conscious Will, and perhaps known to some of you, Sam Harris wrote a little book called Free Will, in which he makes this case as well. So, being a neuroscientist, I'm interested in what evidence they see so compelling to argue that no reasonable notion of free will doesn't exist. And the kinds of experiments that these folks look at mostly are the kinds of experiments that were done by a scientist named Benjamin Libet. Libet did a variety of experiments trying to get the very basis of when people make a choice and what's going on inside of their brains when they make a choice. And their early experiments look something like this. They're going to have people make a choice of when to make a muscle movement, like flex their wrist. And they can decide freely, when am I going to wiggle my wrist? He wants to measure this. So what does he do? He has sensors that can be placed on the muscle, electromyogram sensors, that can detect electrical field changes in the muscle that detect exactly when people move that muscle. They're not invasive, you can just place them on the skin and sense the movement of these muscles. But he's interested in what's going on in the brain prior to this. A reasonable place to look, if we're talking about a choice to move a muscle, would be areas in the brain associated with movements. Just in front of this sulcus, this groove in the brain, there's primary motor cortex. There's an area that seems to be involved in directing muscles. On the left-hand side of your brain, it seems to control the muscles on the right-hand side of your body for the most part, and the right-hand side of your brain controls the muscles on the left-hand side of your body. And then there's a little map there, a little layout of cells that control different muscles. Just anterior, just in front of that, towards the front of your head, is premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area that seem to be more involved in kind of motor planning. So it would be great to be able to record what was going on in these brain areas when people were doing this task, but that would require cracking open their skulls. Well, actually it doesn't. Because these cells also are little electrical devices that generate an electric field. They're really tiny, so it's a very small electric field, but if you have a lot of neurons, a lot of these brain cells that are all pointing in the same direction, the electric field adds up and you can actually sense it outside of the head. You put little sensors on the scalp and sense changes in the electrical field of these cells from outside of the scalp. And this has a name, it's an electroencephalogram, or EEG, that can be recorded. So what Libet did was he wired people up with both EMG and EEG and pointed them at a screen that had a clock so they could see what time it was. And he said to the subjects, whenever you get an urge to move your wrist, but note when you decided to move your wrist. Look at the clock and remember when you decided to move your wrist. And someone on the web very nicely drew this as a cartoon for me. There's a subject with a little sensor on his wrist, connected to the EMG, ready to detect exactly when he moves his wrist. Hat to detect this potential, this change in voltage over premotor areas. And he allegedly is thinking about or deciding to move his wrist. And he's watching the clock. What a good scene. Marked here at 0 milliseconds with time on the x-axis is when the wrist was actually moved. That's the action at 0 milliseconds. And interestingly, about 200 milliseconds, about a fifth of a second before that, that's when people reported deciding to move their wrist. Not a big deal, right? You decide to do something and then you do it. The signal gets down to your wrist and the wrist moves. what's interesting is a full 550 milliseconds before the risk begins. This voltage measurement at the scalp over premotor areas was significantly above its base rate of activity, the dashed line. To the point where you could reliably predict, hey, 550 milliseconds from now, that wrist is going to move. That's 350 milliseconds. It's a third of a second before people knew that they were going to move their wrist, before they reported deciding to move their wrist. Weird. Apparently, the brain, that is to say premotor areas, are choosing before there's conscious awareness of the choice. A lot of conclusions were raised from this by people like Stanislaus. The conclusions were, well, clearly conscious thoughts don't cause our choices. They only reflect some sort of delayed awareness of the choices that were already made subconsciously by our brain. Thus, we're not free to direct our choices through our conscious thoughts, as those choices are determined by biological processes mostly outside of our awareness, or at least preceding our awareness of them. Therefore, any sense that we have of consciously controlling our actions must be an illusion. What do you think? Yeah, in the back.
I'm curious. Did he ever think to do an experiment where he would tell the people, okay, exactly 2:01, move your wrist? And then,
I'm not sure. In a way that kind of there have been experiments where people have to make the decision based on some sort of input, but it usually isn't that precise.
Yeah,
it's usually something like, tell me whether you see a T in this display or something like that, right?
There would be a difference.
But he did do other experiments, which I'll get to in a second. But before I do, let me note that this position of an illusionary will actually isn't new with it. Going back 100 years before David Hume, to Spinoza, you had people that thought that this was probably the case. Spinoza said, so experience itself, no less clearly than reason, teaches that men believe themselves free because they are conscious of their own actions and ignorant of the causes by which they are determined. So even Spinoza, in the 1600s here, had this sense that we don't know where our choices are coming from. And I guess it's something that you can understand, right? I don't know where the choices are coming from for the words coming out of my mouth right now. It's not that I can introspect and say, okay, I think I need a noun next. What noun should I choose? The words are just coming out of my mouth through some processes that are completely subconscious to me. Your understanding of my words aren't something that you are conscious of. It's not like you're saying, okay, that was a noun phrase, that's a verb phrase, so that must be a complete... So no, those things are going on completely automatically and subconsciously within you. So it's not a surprise to some degree that someone like Spinoza had this intuition. But still, there are problems with Harris and other people's interpretations of it. And the main question is whether this task, wiggling your wrist, is really a good model for the kind of task that we mean when we're talking about should I decide whether I'm going to get married or not. It seems like a very different sort of thing. It's not like someone says, okay, when you get here, you should get married. You know, there's deliberation. There's this lengthy period of time. And maybe the processes, the role of consciousness in particular, in this case, of when you're really deliberating, is something that's very different than in the limit experiment where you're just kind of wiggling your wrist. In particular, notice that in this limit task, people were told, okay, when you get an urge to wiggle your wrist, do so. So maybe what was detected over premotor areas was not the choice, not the decision, but the urge. It was just this kind of, oh yeah, I feel like wiggling my wrist. And because they were instructed whenever they get that urge to do so, they always decided to do so whenever they got that urge. So maybe that signal wasn't a detection of a choice prior to consciousness. It was a detection of the urge, which was always followed by a choice later, perhaps around the time of consciousness. Maybe. Also, there seems to be some conscious effect on some of these effects. Speaking of other experiments he did an experiment where you could kind of cancel your decision later, but he found that you could only change your mind and reverse your decision at a certain time window after you became consciously aware of originally making the choice to do the action. As if you needed to get to that point of consciousness before you could inhibit or stop the original choice. This has led some commentators to say Libet doesn't believe in free will, but he does believe in free won't. That you can freely, with consciousness, stop something, but not do it. Now, I think that's just an artifact of the experiment as well. You didn't do an experiment where you could choose to do something different. You only did an experiment where you could cancel the previous thing. So it could be that there are some kinds of choices that do require, if not consciousness, then processes that are often traveling alongside with consciousness. And indeed, if you look at the whole literature on, the whole psychology literature on decision-making, there's lots and lots of effects of deliberation. If you give people time and you give them a chance to verbalize their thoughts, they will change the kinds of decisions that they make. It seems like there's got to be some effects here of consciousness. So with that retort in mind, let's return to our choice here between free will being an illusion, based on these neuroscientific studies, and compatibilism. The compatibilists say for a moment, hold on, they say, before we jump on the Libet bandwagon here and think that this is what all choices are like, let's see if there's some notion of free will that really is compatible with a deterministic world. And one of them, again, supported by Richard Carrier, Dr. Carrier here in the Bay Area, is that we already have kind of an intuitive notion of a compatibilist version of free will. It's kind of boiled into the way that we do law and punishment in this country. The idea is that a choice is free, and it's not contra-causally free, but in this definition, a choice is free when it results from a conscious, deliberative process applying valid knowledge that you have in pursuit of your desires, goals, and intentions. In other words, your choice is free when you knew the likely outcome of your choice, you desired that outcome, and you made that choice. Essentially, if you did what you wanted to do, it was a free choice. Now, this is perfectly compatible with determinism, because there's nothing about determinism that says you can't have desires, that some pattern of neural firing in your brain encodes what you want, that you can have knowledge, that certain configurations of activity in your brain could encode that you know the outcome of a particular action. And just because those things were caused by the past doesn't mean that they're real, doesn't mean that they can't be there. And so Dr. Carrier says, here's a coherent view of what it means to make a free choice. You did what you wanted to do. He points out that this is really consistent with jurisprudence, with current case law. If I'm joking around and I think the gun is empty and I point it at Terry's head and pull the trigger and blow his brains out, I'm not going to be accused of murder because I didn't think the gun was loaded. And I didn't want to kill Terry either. So I neither had knowledge nor intent. I might be guilty of something else, negligence or idiocy or something, but not murder, right? So the standard in law here is, did you do what you wanted to do? And he points out that this is even true in matters of mental illness. That for someone to be not guilty for reason of insanity, it has to be the case that their insanity caused a change in their knowledge, that they didn't think this was a knife, they thought it was a feather or something like that, so they really didn't know what they were doing. That if they did know what they were doing, they knew they were going up in the tower to shoot people on the street, they were going to die and that's murder. If they knew what they were doing, they were guilty. Guilty but insane, but guilty, according to current jurisprudence. So Dr. Carrier says there's a very coherent notion of free will here that's perfectly consistent with determinism. And for the most part, I like it. But I think there's one worry that people have raised, and that is this focus on this deliberation being conscious. There's just so much that we do that is not conscious. Now, that's not to say consciousness can't play a role. Libet might have exaggerated how unconscious things can be. There's so much that's unconscious that drives what we do. So while the Libet experiments don't rule out an important role for consciousness and deliberation, there's little doubt that non-conscious processes deeply affect our decisions. If I can call to mind some relevant factor about that car that I want to buy, I might make a different choice than if I can't bring it to mind. And I can't control whether it comes to mind or not. Maybe the dealer at that car dealership reminded me of my grandfather, and that's why I kind of trust him more, but I don't know that that's why I trust him more. These factors play a role in our deliberation, even at an extended time scale. My favorite example of this was a study that was done where they laid out stockings and said, okay, tell me which of these stockings you prefer. So, oh, I like these. They're a little bit softer than the other ones. A little bit softer, and yeah, the color is a little bit nicer. Even though the stockings were all identical, we'd shuffle them around every trial. But there was a pattern. People would pick the stockings on the right. Allegedly because people read left, right, they sampled the ones on the right last, and whichever ones they looked at last, they tended to prefer a little bit more. Not because they were softer or had a better color, but because they were on the right, and they had no idea it was because they were on the right. The literature is full of these kinds of biases, these non-conscious sorts of biases in people's decisions, and they seem to play a very real role. So much so that philosopher and cognitive scientist Dan Dennett, one of the people that is best known for his work on free will, a long time ago called Elbow Room, followed it up with a more recent book called Freedom Evolves. He really said, look, we need to open the door to the possibility that a free choice can be made not only consciously, but as part of unconscious processes as well. This is great except for one thing. If I have a seizure and my hand hits somebody, that's an unconscious process. I'm not consciously choosing to flail my limbs. And I don't want to say that it was a free choice to hit someone. Whereas if I go up and punch somebody in the nose, that was a free choice. So if we're going to open the door to non-conscious processes contributing to free choices, we need some other way to tell the difference between a free choice and a non-free choice, something other than conscious awareness like Dr. Carrier's approach. We need some way to tell when we are in control of our choices. How we can discriminate between the cases when we're in control and the cases when we're not in control. Now you might think that it feels different. It feels different to be in control. But if you look at pathological cases, this isn't true. There are schizophrenics that think that they're not in control, that the orbital mind control lasers are controlling their every deed, but indeed they really are the ones making those choices. There are people with obsessive compulsive disorder that need to close the door 3 times every time they go through the door, but if you ask them if they are compelled to do that, they'll say, no, I freely chose to close the door 3 times. They feel like they're in control even though it appears that they're compelled to perform this deed. So it's more than feeling. I asked the philosopher Pat Churchland in San Diego, who has written on moral philosophy and its association with brain. Here's a book by her, Brain Trust. I asked her, what do you think the mechanism of control in the brain is like? And she said, I think it's like dirt. What did she mean? If I go to a chemist and say, give me the chemical formula for dirt, the chemist will laugh at me and say, there is no one chemical formula for dirt. Dirt is a colloquial term that means different things in different contexts. There's lots of different kinds of dirt. There is no one thing that is dirt. And what Pat was saying to me is that there probably isn't one way to be in control. In particular, there probably isn't one place in the brain, one module, that is your decision module, your will module for making these decisions. And if it's broken, you're out of control. The metaphor I like to use for this about how the brain actually often gives rise to its behaviors through an interaction of many different pieces is turning left in your car. Here's a function that your car does all the time. It makes a left-hand turn. Is there a left-hand turn module in your car? Can you go into the dealership and say, you need to replace the left-hand turn module and not turn the left? No. Left-hand turns arise through the interaction of the drive shaft, the brakes, the steering wheel, the turn signal. All of these things interact in a way to give rise to that particular behavior. Similarly, being in control probably is an interaction of many different brain processes coming together in one particular way. Or maybe several different ways depending on different individuals. Yeah.
I'm waiting for duress to enter in here. Law recognizes mistake / insanity as a defense, but duress, where you feel compelled by another, or that's actually the best case of an unfree will. Somebody's holding a gun to your head telling you to do something.
Right. And there's a number of different perspectives here, right? There's the perspective that you really are making a free choice. It's a rational economic choice between whether you're going to get your brains blown out or you're going to do this thing. To the question, the practical question of whether we want to heap blame on a person for following through. And I think if you'll hold on, when we get to legal issues at the end of this talk. We'll come back to the practical aspect of that question. So, again, control. Where's control? It's going to be hard to find. One place that we might look is to look at people that are out of control. And that's what Dr. Adrian Rain has done. He's a psychiatrist interested in criminology, and he's looked at the brains of people that make really fucked up decisions, like going up in towers and shooting people, and asked what's going on in their heads. One thing that he's focused on is a part of the brain that's really close to my heart, well, close to my head, close to the front of my head. It's the prefrontal cortex. It's a little bit ahead of those motor areas that Libet recorded from. Prefrontal cortex is a big area, and it's associated with a wide variety of capabilities. Capabilities like planning, capabilities like choosing the right thing to do, even when it's not the most reflexive thing to do. A colleague of mine likes to say, prefrontal cortex is what keeps you from scratching a mosquito bite. It's involved with inhibiting inappropriate behaviors. It's involved with working memory, keeping in mind those things that are relevant for the current task. And what Dr. Rain did was he looked at prefrontal cortex and other brain areas by having people do tasks that are associated with the frontal lobes. Executive tasks, planning tasks, see if they could avoid doing the thing that's really tempting to do, the really reflexive thing, see if they can keep from intellectually scratching the mosquito bite, and then he'd look at their brains. And the way he did it was using a technology called PET scanning, or positron emission tomography. What this involves is injecting the patient with a radioactive tracer that stacks up in brain cells that are really busy, that are doing a lot of work. And then you have them do one of these tasks, where they have to focus on planning or focus on inhibiting a response, and then you put them in a machine that can read where those radioactive tracers are stacked up, and you get these nice false color maps that show the more bright colors, the more hot colors, that's where there was a lot of action, where the brain was really busy. And he was able to do this on people that made bad decisions. Like a guy named Antonio Bustamante. Antonio Bustamante had a lot of problems. He had a heroin addiction. He was burglarizing a home one night when the resident there, an 80-year-old man that really posed no threat to him, surprised him. And, he could have easily just picked up his stuff and walked away. The guy really was no threat, but Mr. Bustamante decided to beat this man to death with his fists. Then, covered in blood, he walked out into the town and proceeded to try to figure out how he was going to fence his goods and get away with this process, completely oblivious to the fact that his crime was there on his clothing as he was walking around the town. He clearly was caught. Dr. Rain was able to look at his brain when he tried to do some of these planning and inhibition tasks. This is the front of your head. Forehead, you're looking down. This is the back of your head. This is a control subject, a healthy person, like you and me, I hope. This is Bustamante. Notice out here in the frontal pole in the front, there just isn't a lot of action. Out there in the frontal pole, seems like things aren't working well. And indeed, when Dr. Rain looked at a whole bunch of convicted murderers, he found the same thing. Frontal lobe just wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. What does that mean? Why would low activity in the frontal lobe be associated with these kinds of choices? Well, the frontal lobe is associated with inhibiting inappropriate responses. If you have a big lesion, if you have a stroke and a big part of your frontal lobe is gone, you might be visiting a friend and the phone would ring and you'd answer the phone. Why? Because when phones ring, you answer the phone. And you can't inhibit this reflexive response because you're at a friend's place. There have been cases where people walked into the bedroom at a friend's place and started to undress to go to bed because, well, that's what you do in bedrooms. You can't inhibit this inappropriate response. Sounds like a problem that Mr. Bustamante might have had in that spur of the moment when he was surprised. You can't develop good plans like how you're going to get away when your shirt is covered with blood. You can't keep the ramifications of your actions in mind. What's going to happen if I do this? Frontal lobes not only are about holding knowledge, but it's about manipulating, keeping it in mind, keeping it in a place where you can use it for reasoning. And if you have bad frontal function, you won't be able to keep those things in mind. But it's not all about the brain. Interestingly, It could be interactions between the brain and the social situation that these folks find themselves in. So for example, if you're faced with an environment that introduces possibilities for drug addiction, maybe you'll make some bad choices and get addicted to heroin, and then you need to find money to buy the heroin. There's this kind of vicious cycle that could emerge, interacting between the deficits that are already there in the brain and the opportunities presented by the environment. If you don't have good social and economic support, you might have difficulty maintaining relationships because you keep putting your foot in your mouth, doing really stupid things. And so you don't have the social support you need. You might not be able to keep a job, and you don't have the economic support. So you end up with people that have this neurological problem, but it interacts with their environments in order to make things really bad. So where could the problems have come from? Short answer is we don't know. But there are some hints. So for example, there's a gene that seems to be inherited across parents and children that both turn out to run around and kill people and do other kinds of violent crimes. It's called the MAOA gene. And it seems to affect a wide variety of, it's involved in the metabolism of a wide variety of neurotransmitters, chemicals in your brain, things like dopamine and serotonin. You might have heard of norepinephrine chemicals that actually play a very important role in the frontal lobe. Dopamine, for example, in my own theories, plays an important role of learning when a situation is appropriate to do a particular task, learning from experience how to direct that kind of frontal control. So if you have broken dopamine, if you have broken chemical systems, frontal lobes are going to have a hard time. What's more, when Dr. Rain looked at a bunch of people that were incarcerated and were classified in the psychiatric category of having antisocial disorders, he found that the size of frontal cortex was actually smaller. 9% less than the orbital frontal gyrus, just above your eyes, 19% smaller in the right ventral medial PFC, areas that are associated with evaluating the value of different situations, and importantly, 20% smaller on the right frontal gyrus, dorsolateral parts of frontal cortex, areas that are associated with inhibition and planning and the like.
Yeah. I noticed when you had Bustamante's brain up there, that area was really active, the right side of it.
It was probably more posterior than we thought. A lot of the frontal stuff still was not overall, and also that slide was just one slice.
Okay.
So if you average across.
Okay, I was just wondering, because that's been associated with kind of religious hallucinations and stuff too.
Interesting, I'd like to talk to you about that. I don't know about frontal involvement in hallucinations. Now, these decreased volumes are not a hole in the head. They're not a lesion. They're not a tumor. It's distributed. It would be really hard to see in a brain scan. It's just fewer cells there. It's less volume. It's less tissue. And only through careful measurements was Dr. Ray able to even notice this. So, interestingly, we're not talking about patient populations here. We're not talking about people like our shooter in the tower who had a tumor. We're not talking about people with Tourette's syndrome who can't help but spit out something offensive. I'm talking about people that, for all intents and purposes, look like they had a normal development for our society, but their brains are still different. And they end up doing some really bad things, making some bad choices. There's actually some evidence that people with low socioeconomic status, people living in poverty, have decreased frontal function. It's not clear why. It could be anything from bad diet to just living in a very stressful environment. But there is some evidence that just putting people in these kinds of social situations, these kinds of environments, could be producing changes in the brain that aren't pathological in the sense that they're in the disease category, but are still giving rise to bad choices. Now, before I wrap this up, I don't want to leave you with the sense that it's all about the frontal lobes, even though I love the frontal lobes. I'm going to point you at another person here. This is Randy Kraft. Randy Kraft in the 80s methodically went out and seduced boys and young men, then would drug them, torture them at his leisure, sometimes dismember them, and then dump their bodies out of his car along the freeway, giving him a nickname as the freeway killer, though, but it was later found that he actually kept a kind of a scorecard describing every one of his kills. He later became referred to as the scorecard killer. Randy Kraft was bright, he was pleasant, people found him attractive, he very easily could seduce these young men and get their attention. He had very good planning skills. He knew exactly what to do in order to keep these people under control while he tortured them. He knew exactly where to dump them in order to avoid being detected. This was not a frontal problem for Mr. Kraft, and indeed, when Dr. Raines looked at Randy Kraft's brain, he found exactly that. So in the middle here, the multiple murder slot is Kraft's brain. You see activity up here in the frontal lobe, again at the top of the slide, that's much like the normal, unlike your more reactive murderer, like Mr. Bustamante. Mr. Kraft is making some really awful decisions, some pretty maladaptive decisions here, but it's not because of a problem with the frontal lobe. Looking at a variety of psychopaths, the same pattern was found. This proactive murderer, someone like Kraft, has this very robust, sometimes even stronger activity than a normal control, whereas people like Mr. Bustamante are very weak. So what's wrong? What's wrong with the psychopaths? It's not the frontal lobe. Seems to be stuff going on deep inside the brain. Down here, remember that tumor by the amygdala? There seems to be abnormalities in the amygdala and the hippocampus, these areas that are deep down inside the brain, and that crumpled sheet of tissue that makes up the cortex. And those areas are associated with emotional regulation and fear, aggression responses, but in an interesting way. So in the psychopath, strong PFC function, including, you can actually see increased white matter in people that are, say, pathological liars. So they actually have these really strong PFCs. And in the limbic system, they have dysfunction of the amygdala, this almond-shaped area. Abnormal fear condition, they don't seem to get afraid. Maybe you want to call it courage, maybe not. Nothing scares them. Nothing arouses them. They seem to have difficulty representing emotion that they are perceiving in others. They have a low resting heart rate. This is a remarkable correlation. Large fraction of these psychopaths just feel really calm. Low resting heart rate, low stress reactivity. You try to stir them up, and you can measure how stressed they get from micro changes in their sweat glands, something called galvanic skin response. Very small response. Now, interestingly, it interacts with environment. This isn't, again, all about genes. It isn't all about your brain. It turns out that there are a lot of people with low resting heart rate and some of these other symptoms, but because they had a very rich childhood environment, they have not presented with psychopathy. Whereas almost invariably, the people that had all these problems and were raised by someone other than their natural parents, were bumped from foster home to foster home, they are the ones that present with these symptoms, with these problems. Again, an interaction. So let's pull this back a little bit. I'm going to try to wrap up here. There's an opportunity here for there being a compatibilist view of free will that includes non-conscious processes in the decision-making process. But to work this out, we need some way to figure out when we're in control and when we're out of control. And neuroscience is just starting that process. It seems to have something to do with the frontal lobes, but it's going to be a whole lot more complicated than that. Interestingly, this isn't just about compatibilism. Even people like Sam Harris that think that free will is an illusion are going to want to say that sometimes people really deserve, or they really were in control. We need to treat them differently than if they weren't in control. So this issue of figuring out when we're in control of our actions and when we're not is a problem for both the illusionists and for the compatibilists. So as we're sorting this out, what does this mean? Let's kind of bring this home. Some people have argued that if you're a determinist, if you believe that the world falls out according to these scientific laws, that means that nobody's responsible for what they do, right? They're not responsible for the genetic factors and the childhood development that gave rise to their brains. So we really just need to empty our prisons because none of those prisoners really are responsible for those actions. They're not responsible for the structure and function of their brain, so we need to respect that and not blame them. And what I'd like to communicate to you is that that doesn't necessarily follow. That it depends on what you think justice is all about. What is the purpose of our criminal justice system? Here's the statue at the top of the Old Bailey. In one hand, there are the balance plates. And the balance plates here, I'm going to say, they make me think of kind of balancing the moral ledger. That if I do a crime, I need to be punished in somehow a balanced way to that crime. I need to suffer in somehow proportion to what I did. It's all about balance. It's all about making the ledger balance. It's all about getting the equality right. But this is tough because there's nothing in the physical world that will tell us how much punishment a burglary is worth. Right? There's nothing, we can't do an experiment and say, oh yeah, we should punish them for 10 years because they did breaking and entry. There's nothing in the world that says what that balance is. But there's another purpose for justice that might be easier to ground. And that's to protect the public good, to make sure that we don't have to worry about people walking around in our neighborhoods preparing to climb a tower and shoot us. To keep our property and our lives, our well-being safe. And if we focus a little bit more on protecting the public good, that balancing starts to matter a little bit less. It may be the case that we don't know exactly how in control this individual was, but we can't let him on the street. We have to do something about this individual. We have to come up with a way to protect the public good, regardless of the level of control. And I would argue then that this whole issue of free will, to some degree, matters almost not at all when it comes to matters of justice. It only matters if you're wed to the moral ledger model of justice. What's more, taking a compatibilist view, or for that matter, even an illusionist view here, actually is a practical thing, a good thing if you're trying to solve our social problems. Accepting the full range of causal forces, acting on our decisions, opens the door to many approaches for improving the public good. We can focus on different ways to rehabilitate prisoners through behavioral methods, through medical methods, through chemical methods, maybe surgical methods, but even beyond the prisoners, we can come up with scientifically supported ways to deter people from committing crimes in the first place. Not just assume that they won't pay the price that we have set on the crime, but scientifically justify things that will modify their behaviors. We can detect early and perhaps remediate high-risk individuals, people that have poor frontal function or other changes to their brain that put them at risk for making some really bad choices. And we can honestly address the ramifications of aspects of our society that can lead to some of these bad choices. Aspects like poverty, inequality, and other societal structures. The last thing I want to point out here, and really the reason that I wanted to speak to this group, is that I worry, and I'm starting to see, this issue, these misconceptions that say, if we don't have a libertarian version of free will, we can't have justice. Those kinds of misconceptions that if determinism is true, fatalism must be true, and I don't have any reason to do anything. These kinds of misconceptions are leading people to attack science. First neuroscience, and then the whole program of trying to find natural laws. Some religious traditions in particular are dogmatically committed to libertarianism. They need there to be this radical kind of free will in order to justify the narrative of kind of cosmic justice. And thus neuroscientific findings of biological causal forces acting on decision making are being rejected out of hand and used to justify increased distrust of scientific approaches to understanding our world. If you thought the battle over evolution was bad, I think this is going to be just as bad. As we discover more and more about the biological forces that give rise to our choices, you're going to see a lot of people pushing back and seeing, see, this is why science is wrong, it's trying to bring our society down. And we need to educate ourselves to know that there are compatibilist positions. That science is compatible with notions of being in control and not being in control, and with pragmatic, utilitarian approaches to justice that keep our streets safe. So this is my last slide. And it's pretty much the conclusions that I took away as I put this material together. Maybe they're your conclusions too, maybe not. Right now, I think there's currently no reason to doubt determinism. There's little reason to think there's some magical thing that underlies free will that isn't causal, isn't randomness. Contra-causal free will lacks a plausible mechanism, and it doesn't seem to be a type of free will that's worth having. Therefore, there isn't really much of an interest in it to try to make it libertarianism work. Whether you dismiss free will as an illusion or see it as compatible with determinism is really largely a function of what you mean by free will, particularly with regard to the role of consciousness. If you think that consciousness is needed for free will, then yeah, free will is an illusion because you make decisions based on non-conscious forces. If you're willing to expand your notion of the self, then maybe you're a compatibilist. It's just a matter of terminology here. Regardless, some distinction between being in control and being out of control is important, and modern neuroscience is just starting to sort out the nature of self-control, the prefrontal cortex taking center stage. Determinism encourages us to take a more utilitarian perspective on our justice system, making more practical choices. And a free will debate may prompt additional hostility towards neuroscience and towards science in general, and we need to be on our guard for that. With that, I am eager to hear your freely chosen questions.
I'm excited to hear this whole thing. And one of the reasons it's exciting to me is because recently a young man in New Hampshire went crazy and took his mom's guns and killed all his kids. Well, that was a horrible tragedy. But the conversations that I heard people were this huge big division, almost like a battle that we're talking about, was the anti-gun people, they said, get all the guns off the street, that was all the problem. And then there were the, oh, we need better mental health care, you know, if we had just known that this boy, you know, he was crazy or whatever, then we could have locked him up. But either one of us, it never really got to the point where we went, wait a minute, we have to look at, you know, we can't literally go and analyze every person in the world to see if they might do a crime like that. And unfortunately, the ones who are ending up in the prisons aren't the ones that are doing just, you know, off-the-cuff kind of things like that, because he died. Really, he died, you know, they don't end up in prison.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see a societal conversation that goes to the deeper level of what really is happening there, because those two conversations were so superficial.
Yeah, and also interactions. So one of the examples that Dr. Rain brings up in his book, The Anatomy of Violence, has to do with a frontal lobe patient that's very famous in the literature named Phineas Gage. I know some of you have heard of this patient. He was a railroad foreman that was clearing rock, and the way they do this is they drill a hole, put down some gunpowder, cover it with sand, tap it down, light it, and blow the rock away. Well, he was distracted during the process and didn't notice that the sand hadn't been laid, and he took this iron rod and hit the gunpowder directly. It sparked, sent the rod up through his cheek and out the top of his head, flying away, and surprisingly, he regained consciousness, retained coherence, but his personality radically changed. This damage to his frontal lobe made him really excited about get-rich-quick schemes, ran off. Some people say that he married a prostitute, just all sorts of crazy things. He went from being a very respectable member of his community to doing all sorts of bad decisions, really bad things. I like the report from his doctors. Doctor reports that he was swearing a lot. And it's like, man, if I had an iron rod in my head, I'd probably be swearing a lot. But the interesting point that Rain brings up is that there was a similar case. There was a man in Spain that similarly had damage done to his frontal lobe. I think his was done by a crossbow bolt of all things. And he did not run off and do all sorts of crazy things because he had rich parents and a loving wife that set up an environment where, despite his disability, he was able to do some work, that was able to bring in some money. Even though he wasn't great at it, he couldn't stay focused, he had all these similar sorts of problems. They provided an environment, a structure in which it didn't give rise to all of the bad choices and bad outcomes that we're seeing in the case of Phineas Gage. So it's not just about the biology, it's about the interaction of the biology and the environment. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a granddaughter who had a stroke inside of her mother, and the left side of her brain is dead. She's also been diagnosed with Asperger's, and that's what the woman down here brought up about the kid. How does that? We've seen some violence in her. Is that? She has epilepsy too. She's a survivor of cancer.
Yeah, well, I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not going to diagnose
No, I just
your
saying,
loved
how
one
does
here in
that?
this forum, but it is definitely the case that, violent insult to the brain can give rise to all sorts of emotional problems as well as decision-making problems. One thing that's hopeful is the brain is very plastic, particularly in younger people. Other brain regions can compensate for tissue that's lost sometimes, particularly if the right kinds of experiences are given to folks. So again, it's not a matter of finding the right drugs necessarily. It might be the right environment in order to get the brain to do the right thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, JP.
Are there critiques of Levitt's experiment that are like methodological, like about how we use EEG? There's like EEG slow spatial resolution when doing brain imaging, so maybe you just was getting a really late reading or things like that.
So EEG though has great temporal resolution, right? And that's all he really cared about. He didn't really care that it was coming from premotor cortex. As long as it came early, it was an interesting signal to him. So that particular criticism really hasn't appeared, at least I haven't seen in the literature. All the criticisms I raised, however, have appeared somewhere else in the literature. They're not mine.
Because there's there's electrical potentials on the scalp as well, like there's like all over the body,
Yeah, sure.
including the brain. So I don't know, but yeah.
And there are various methods to try to factor those out, right? And so yeah, to the degree that those are issues, they're issues for every EEG study. So I doubt that they were specifically singled out. That's a good question. So yeah.
One thing I like about the therapeutic model that seemed to be in the back of them, we just are looking just at the moral landscape,
Yeah.
is it's capable of actually objectively posing the question and answering what kind of behaviors can you reward or punish and change people's decision to do that. That's the difference between an epileptic seizure versus somebody hitting somebody.
That's right.
If I reward this person or punish them, I can change their future behavior, and you can actually chart that out.
That's right. And this very practical approach to justice allows us to take this perspective that praise and blame are not about balancing the pans. They're not about giving the exact amount of praise worthy to what was done or the amount of blame. It's about what effects those things are going to have in the future. So for the exact same behavior, maybe a certain kind of praise and blame is a good thing because it actually will modify that person. But for another person who generated the same behavior for different reasons, that's not the appropriate response at all.
They might need chemicals.
They might need chemicals. They might need other kinds of behavioral interventions. It might be that we don't have an answer for them at all, and all we can do is lock them up and keep them safe. But at least we have that knowledge to bring to bear. We're not forced to ask this metaphysical question of exactly what is the price of committing a burglary or something, right? It's much more practical. It's what will have an effect, what will make us safer, what will protect the public good. Yeah. Okay. Got both of you right there.
I'm curious about the weight of the in control, not in control distinction. Because what I'm thinking is, insofar as the effects in the brain of the abnormal brains are responsible for the behavior of the abnormal brain individual, at the same time, it seems obvious that by implication that means that the nature of normal brains is what is responsible for normal behavior, so that the whole level of responsibility, it doesn't seem to me that you can make a responsibility distinction there.
So one of the reasons that I picked out these examples that Dr. Wayne had looked at, these criminals, rather than looking at, again, people with Tourette's or other kinds of lesions, is to highlight exactly this point, that it's a continuum, right? That to the same degree that we can say having a thinner right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex made these murderers more prone to do these violent acts, the same degree means that thicker, healthier PFCs with proper childhood development made us do the things that we might consider praiseworthy, right? It's all on the same continuum. But that doesn't mean that we can't find a distinction to make between levels of control. Clearly, we want to respond differently to the epileptic seizure that hit someone and the person that methodically planned out, okay, I know Joe's coming around the corner, I got my arm back, I'm going to punch him in the nose. those. There's very different ways to respond to that because there are very different brain processes that give rise to that behavior. And it's a distinction worth making. Certainly, they're both the result of the brains that these people have in different situations, but it's important to make the distinction to determine how we're going to respond.
That, I guess, I don't want to follow up too much, but that's kind of what my question is about. I mean, historically, of course, we have made an enormous distinction, but, and here I am probably inclining away from compatibilism and towards that maybe what we have to take seriously is that there really isn't much of a distinction except in the sense of which is more dangerous and likely to happen.
Or which kinds of response options are going to be most effective. And I'd be happy with that. I'm perfectly fine with making the distinction based on these practical grounds. They're important distinctions to make. But I think when we make them, we're going to find that we need to know something about the functioning of the brain in order to make those distinctions. Yeah.
I know neurofeedback, I don't know too much about it, but I know it's kind of a hot topic where you kind of have people consciously try to activate areas of the brain that normally aren't active.
Yeah.
I don't know if they've done this a lot with criminals and trying to activate that and how that would fit into any of these models.
So the only work that I know about is there are people that are really interested in various compassion-based meditation practices and what effect it has on frontal function and kind of decreasing kind of aggressive responses. And they've put these people in brain scanners and noticed differences in amygdala activation and frontal activation as a result of these kind of meditative processes. I don't know the data on kind of long-term effects of these kinds of manipulations, but you know, it's possible. There's a concern though, and it has to do with our societal attitude. I mean, how many people, if you went out of this room onto the street and said, hey, we want to raise money to set up a meditation program for murderers. We're going to give them some nice massages, get them to relax, right? People really have embroiled in their head this kind of balanced model of justice. Right? And so even if we can find an effect, it's going to be a real challenge to bring it into practice. I'm not saying it's not a battle worth fighting, but there's a battle to fight there. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and I guess how, if that did work theoretically, if we had the resources and prisons and that as part of the rehabilitation program, how that would even fit in these models, whether that adds to the component of free will or disputes it, I don't know.
In the back.
Do you know if there's been any ground covered as far as making testing more quick to do, or so you can do it on a more large scale with group of people? I mean, if you have to give them radioactive tracers and scan their brain one at a time, you're not going to be able to do it to a whole lot of people. And if you want to be proactive rather than reactive down the line, you need to have some sort of a mass testing of people, right?
So you can look at behavioral differences. There definitely are measures of frontal function that are paper and pencil and things that you can do on a computer. The problem is that for some of these people in bad situations, they actually didn't perform. Their actual behavior wasn't that much worse in the nice, calm laboratory environment. The brain measure was much more sensitive. It could really pick out differences with much more sensitivity than seeing the differences in their scores. So again, it's a challenge to come up with things that will be adequately sensitive, but at least for a first cut to catch the really bad cases, there are certain tests out there that can be tried.
I was thinking this has to do with being in control, so I wanted to throw like at you. So there's the idea of being controlled, being out of control, but what if there's like radiate scale, where at the end, you know, the being out of or least control is some of the reflexive properties that we have, and then being in most control is this conscious state of, you know, having conscious decision making. I mean, could that be a possibility?
I would sign on to that immediately.
Yeah.
There's really good data to suggest that your level of control is really a graded measure, that, you know, some mosquito bites are easier to avoid scratching than others, right? And so there are different levels of control, certainly. I'm only making the distinction as a tool for highlighting the extremes.
I think that's about the time that we have. Okay. I'd like everyone to thank Dr. Noelle.
joining us at the Pizza Factory, and I hope that we can continue this amazing conversation and keep those questions coming while we feed you. And so please, I encourage you guys to wrap up, and then please come on over and join us just around the corner of Monte Vista and some C Street, whatever. Anyway, just right around the corner. And so please join us. Thank you all very much for coming. If you have any questions about our group, don't hesitate to see me, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.